Hello everybody, it's great to be back. Today we're going to be starting lesson 4 of Lightening the Load. He makes me lie down in green pastures. We'll be talking about the first part of verse 2. And it's based on your reading in Keller, which is the shepherd looks at Psalm 23, chapter 3, he makes me lie down in green pastures. And also Lucado, Traveling Light, chapter 5, where it says, I will give you rest. And we'll be talking about the burden of weariness. And before we get into that, I have a quick video clip that I did at home today before I came over to do this video recording. And it talks about traveling, and if any of you have ever done international travel, you know how weary you can be afterwards. So take a look at the clip and then we'll be back in just a minute. Okay, so we know how Lucado used the illustration on weariness about the traveler trying to get his bags off of the conveyor belt and how they could just be dragging. And I got to thinking about that because I've made a lot of trips internationally by myself, and I know what it feels like when he was using that explanation. At the end of a long trip, especially if you've been on an overnight trip and having to get those suitcases off of the carousel, it can be really, really hard. And so I wanted to show you a little bit of kind of what that could look like. So with our suitcases, we now have what's a 50-pound limit per bag. And so I came out to my garage because I happen to have 50-pound bags of Quikrete. And if my photographer can come over here and show you, you can see that each one of these weighs 50 pounds. This is for a project for a railing for my front porch that just hasn't been done yet. So I'm going to take this 50-pound bag, okay, and it is heavy. So I'm going to put it in this suitcase. And that just about actually fills it up. Okay, so that's 50 pounds. And I can pick it up. And it's heavy. I can't imagine, I hardly remember what it was like before suitcases had rollers. But you can imagine what this feels like after 10 hours on a plane of sitting upright, trying to sleep but not really being able to, and trying to get this bag off of the carousel and then put it on possibly a rolling cart unless you have to pay for them, which most of us don't like to have to do. So this gives you an idea of how heavy, just to put it in perspective, when he uses that, when you're already weary and then you're having to pick up these suitcases and then take them and handle them and eventually probably put them on another plane, or I'm just going to leave that there, just like that, or to take them home and then you have to unpack them or take them to your destination, and it can just, the whole thing is so weary, and that's why we usually crash for about 10 hours after a long flight. So that gives you a little bit of perspective of how the burden of weariness can really affect us. Okay, so I hope you saw that sack of concrete is not what I actually take on my trips, but it does give you an idea of what goes into my suitcase. And that was really dead weight, and it was really heavy, as you could probably see when I was trying to lift it into my suitcase. But that gives you an idea of the weariness that we can just all feel from the burdens that we carry. And then if you talk about, and if you remember what you read in Traveling Light in the introduction, it talks about the malady of insomnia. And I don't know, I brought a few things from home today to show you because I deal with insomnia. I have for a long time, but it's been especially bad since the time that my husband was sick and then after he passed away. And it's something I just really have never, conquered, and the fact that I just don't sleep well. And my problem is I really have a hard time falling asleep. And so I don't know about you, but I have a few things in my bedside drawer. One of them is melatonin, which I will
use if I can't, you know, I try not to, but you know how it is when you're lying there for an hour or more trying to get to sleep. And then of course this is the generic version of Benadryl, but that's also can help you get to sleep. These I try to do when I know that I have to get some sleep. There are also lots of natural remedies. Chamomile tea is one of the more famous ones, but which I didn't specifically have at home, but I did have a couple of teas that in my tea collection. One is called Honey Lavender Stress Relief, and this one is called Love. It is a heartwarming touch of organic rose, chamomile, and lavender. But if you look at the ingredients on both of these teas, the first one is chamomile, which is a well-known relaxer. And so chamomile tea can help. It helps you relax a little bit. I don't know that it's ever actually really helped me to fall asleep, but some people it does. And so, you know, I feel like if I'm really struggling and getting frustrated, then, you know, take some melatonin. It's also a natural sleep support. Or, you know, just pray, talk to the Lord, or do whatever you feel like you need to do. But this malady of insomnia is something that afflicts 70 million people around the world. It's been known to reduce productivity. It afflicts teenagers, it afflicts middle agers, it afflicts seniors. What does it mean? It afflicts everybody. This is something that runs across the age groups. And it involves a wide variety of different treatments, which I just showed you. What are the effects of insomnia? Well, people have been known to doze off at work. Children have been known to nap through class, or teenagers have been. And then probably the most dangerous is falling asleep at the wheel. Truck drivers are especially prone, if they don't get good sleep, to falling asleep at the wheel, and there are statistics that show that this has caused quite a few accidents. What is the solution for all of this? Well, it's rest. Super. Getting rest is easier said than done. And, you know, and I know, I live with it, because even sometimes lying down from a nap, sometimes you just don't fall asleep. And so we just know that this part of insomnia. And so what is the result of this insomnia? And it is weariness. It is being tired all the time and trying to function, being tired all the time. And many of us live with that. And it's just so hard sometimes to deal with. And so when you get to a verse like verse 2 that says, He makes me lie down in green pastures, and the whole implication of that verse is that the sheep are restful. Well, you know, okay, I would love to have that. And obviously David says, okay, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. So we're seeing that, okay, David is secure in his master's care, and because of that, he is able to lie down in green pastures. Well, what does that involve? Well, first of all, we really need to kind of look at the command in Scripture to rest, and it starts way back in Exodus. And it's actually part of the 10 Commandments. If you read Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, and I'll read them here for you. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. God rested on the seventh day not because He was tired. God rested on the seventh day to give us an example to follow, because He knew that we as human beings would become weary and we would need that day. And so we are commanded to rest. And that is why it is important for pastors to take a day off. It is important for lay workers to take a day off. It is important that it's why the weekend is so important to us, to be able to step back from the burdens of this life, from the weariness, and just rest. Isaiah 26:3 says, "You keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you." This also is an allusion to rest. And I find it interesting that this is written in the imperative. You keep him in perfect peace. We're commanded to do this. Matthew 11:28, again, a mandate, an imperative. "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." You feel like you are carrying around that 50-pound bag of concrete on your back all day long and into the night. There are days when I do. And when I picked up that bag this morning, as I was picking it up, and it was just a solid, heavy weight, I thought of all of those burdens that I just carry around with me all day long, and how weary I am at the end of the day because of it. Well, if you read the chapters, you realize that there are 4 conditions or four requirements for rest. In order for sheep to get their rest, 4 conditions have to be met. And it really applies to us as people as well, because we need to have these 4 conditions met in our own lives in order for us to be able to rest. So what are they? First of all is the freedom from fear. We all have fears. I know I dealt with fears, especially when my husband was sick. And that's a subject for another day. But I was confronted with some serious fears that I had to address. And that, I know, contributed to a lot of the insomnia that I experienced during my husband's illness and homegoing. But what do we fear? Our fears can usually be categorized into 2 different categories. One is the unexpected. Keller used the example of when a friend came to visit them and brought her little dog, and that little dog, and if you know Pekingese, they tend to be yappy dogs, and that dog got out of the car and it jumped around and it barked, bark, 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 and what did it do? It sent the sheep off in a tizzy. So those are the unexpected. You know, all of a sudden, you get a cancer diagnosis out of the blue. This is what happened to us. It was unexpected. You're in a car accident. All of a sudden, there's a big pandemic and everybody is on lockdown. Nobody can go anywhere. Nobody can work. People are losing their jobs. The unexpected. And these will cause insomnia, and these will keep us from having rest. You know, Keller stated it really well. When one startled sheep runs in fright, a dozen other will bolt with it in blind fear, not waiting to see what frightened them. It's just a mob reaction. A dog yaps, one sheep bolts, and the rest of the flock just goes and follows them because they have no idea what's going on. The unexpected. What happens in our lives that we just cannot anticipate happening? We fear these things. We're always looking around the corner because I don't know if something is going to jump out at me. It's the unexpected. But then there's also the fear of the unknown. We don't know what the future is going to bring. And this is another thing that I had to deal with. My husband was sick. His prognosis was not good. There were times when he was doing well, there were times when he was not doing well, and I was dealing with the unknown. I had no idea what our future was going to be. I had no idea what my future was going to be. And it was hard, and it contributed to insomnia. When Keller was talking about his sheep, and he talked about the cougars coming in and attacking and killing some of his sheep, and so that he slept with one eye open so that his sheep would rest. And his sheep would rest knowing that he was on guard. But sheep, like people, as long as there is even the slightest suspicion of danger from dogs, coyotes, cougars, bears, or other enemies, the sheep stand up, ready to flee for their lives. Have you ever slept like that? You're just ready. I don't know what's happening, so I just need to be ready all the time. And that will contribute to insomnia. It will contribute to anxiety, which is something we're going to deal with next time. It burdens us, that fear, that constant fear, that knot in your stomach that just won't go away, because anything could happen. The unknown, the unexpected, all of these things will just pop up. And it just happens, and you don't know what to do with it. And so you just lie awake at night thinking about all of these things and how they can happen. So what's the solution? When we get to the end of this, you will see that there is a common denominator in these solutions. The solution is Christ's presence. In both instances where Keller was talking about his sheep could rest knowing, because he was nearby. And they knew that they didn't have to be afraid, because they knew that he would take care of it. If the cougars came around, he was there with his gun. David talked about how he had fought off bears and how he had fought off lions that were trying to attack his flock. His sheep rested securely, knowing that their master, that their shepherd was there. He was present constantly with them. And this was something I really had to deal with in my own life. I had to realize that Christ was present with me in everything, in the unexpected, in the unknown. He was there. And when I realized that, it brought me comfort. So, the first condition, we have to be free from fear. The second condition is that there has to be freedom from conflict. And conflict within the flock is called the budding order. And we know about animals and their pack mentality. Dogs, they run in packs, or wolves, they run in packs, and there is an alpha dog. He is the one that is in charge. Chickens have a pecking order. That is the hen that's in charge. And sheep have a budding order. There is a ewe who is in charge, and she is the one that she's domineering, and she goes around and she butts heads with every other sheep to get them in line. And sometimes that can be a good thing, and sometimes it can be a bad thing. Keller described her as a domineering old ewe will be boss of any bunch of sheep by butting and driving other ewes or lambs away from the best grazing. So, in other words, this person always has their own best interest. And they make sure by butting others in and out of the way to get everybody in line, and that just lines everybody up. And the fact is, in society, there is always a hierarchy. It happens with people. The church has its under shepherd, who is the pastor. It has sometimes a board of deacons. It has trustees, whatever your church has. There are hierarchical structures in all of our realms of life. In the family, it's the man, the father is the head of the household, unless he is not present. There just is a hierarchical order. It's just the way of things, because Christ is the head of the church. God is the head of all. We just know that there is a structure there. And that can cause conflict, because we as sinful human beings are always battling each other. And so there are conflicts between people. And we cannot say that we're not in conflict with somebody. I mean, there are times when we're getting along with everybody, obviously, but there are going to be times when we have conflicting relationships with people, and there are times when there are just people in our lives that are going to butt in, and that's where we get the word, because of the budding order. People will butt in and make themselves known and take over, and that's not always the best thing, and it can cause conflict. And when you're in conflict with somebody, you don't rest well. It's just a rough place to be, and we've all been there. There are times when we just are not getting along, and I mean, it's even addressed in Matthew 18 as it relates to the church, that if there's something going on, you need to address it. Paul talks about it. Before you even take communion, you need to examine yourself. And if you have a conflict with somebody, you need to resolve that before you take your communion. So there are just a lot of things that incite us to get along with each other. In Philippians, Euodia and Syntyche were encouraged to get along. There's just conflict in our lives. But what happens, and again, the solution here is Christ's presence. Because, for example, what happens when a teacher walks back into a disruptive classroom? Total silence. Everybody sits down and gets quiet. I remember when I was in school, I was in elementary school and we lived in Detroit. And in our lunchroom, we always had lunchroom monitors, and it depended on who was monitoring that day, how much conversation was going on. And there was an assistant principal in our school, and she was very strict. And when we were at lunch, when she was on lunchroom duty, there was no conversation at all, ever. We were to eat in silence. I'm not going to go into the philosophy of whether that should have happened or not. That's just neither here nor there. I just remember that on the days that she was not there monitoring, the lunchroom was chaotic. People were talking, people were getting up and moving around. It could just be kind of a madhouse, but as soon as she walked in, it was... And I'm not saying that that was necessarily a good thing, but I do know that when authority steps in a room, all chaos stops, and that's what happens here. You've got that budding old ewe out in the field, and she is pushing all the other lambs out of the way. She wants the best grazing, and she's doing this, but as soon as the shepherd steps out into the field, she stops because she knows the boss is there. And that's exactly how it happens with us. The fact is, Christ is present, and Christ's presence really eliminates a lot of conflict. If you go to Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 20 through 22, it says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord God to them, Behold, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep, because you pushed with side and shoulder and thrusted all the weak with your horns till you have scattered them abroad. I will rescue my flock. They shall no longer be a prey, and I will judge between sheep and sheep." So what is being said here? The master shepherd comes in and he stops all the nonsense. And that is what brings us rest, because somebody comes in and says, enough. We're going to resolve this. And that gives people rest. So if the sheep are not afraid, if the sheep are not in conflict, those are two conditions that have been met. What is the third condition? Well, it's free from aggravations. In aggravations, in this case, as far as the sheep, is pests and insects. Sheep can be driven to absolute distraction by nasal flies, bot flies, warble flies, and ticks. Okay, insects, especially sheep, when their wool gets thick, then especially those ticks are going to bore their way down into, so they can latch into the skin, and that just drives them crazy. So when we lived in Brazil, and I've mentioned this before, that we had a camp. I think I mentioned this to the children, actually. We had a camp on an island, and there was no electricity out there that wasn't provided by a generator. So we would run the generator until about 11 o'clock at night, and then we would shut it down because it would save on fuel. And so all of a sudden at 11 o'clock, things would be completely silent. So I would be lying in my hammock. And if I had a flashlight on trying to read or something, then all the moths would come and gather around the flashlight, and they would just drive me crazy because there was just all this fluttering around on my page while I was trying to read. So that got a little frustrating. But then when I turned it off, then I could hear the mosquitoes buzzing around my ears. And I would swat, at them around my ears, and they'd go away for a second or two, and then they'd come back. And it would drive me absolutely crazy. And I could not go to sleep because just the buzzing constantly around my ears. And I understand what these sheep are feeling when they have these flies around their nose and around their eyes, because they go for the moisture, and it's just so distracting. And if you can't, just get them away from you. And so what does the shepherd do? Well, he applies special oils and chemicals to them, and it keeps those insects away from them, and that gives them rest. And I remember when I would finally get up and I would get out the repellent and I would spray it on my arms and I would spray a little bit on my hand and rub it on my face and I would put it on my ears, and finally I would be able to lie down in my hammock and get some rest. And it was just such a relief to not be bothered by that. And there are so many outside things that just drive us crazy in our lives. And I remember, and those outside distractions, one of the things for me in Brazil was always driving down the road and the motorcycles who don't obey the traffic laws down there. And they would just come around, zoom, 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 zoom around and they just would come up when they would be out of your mirror range. And so and all of a sudden they would just whiz by. And I compared them to mosquitoes buzzing around my head even. So, there are so many distractions and things that can just drive us crazy. And so what do we need to be free from that? And that is the Comforter. The Comforter being the Holy Spirit. In John 14, 16 through 17, Jesus said, "And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you, and he will be in you." This is what Jesus was promising to his disciples and to the church. Okay, I'm not going to be here, but the Spirit will, and he will bring you the comfort that you need. It was such a relief for those sheep to get that oil spread on their faces and on their wool to keep those insects away. And it is such a relief to know that the Spirit is with us even today, because he brings us that comfort from those distractions and those aggravations that come in our lives, the little things and the big things that happen to us, and we just have the hardest time dealing with them because they're like mosquitoes that just buzz around your head. So, 3 conditions have been met. In order for sheep to be able to sleep, they need to be free from fear, they need to be free from conflict, and they need to be free from aggravations. And the last one is to be free from hunger. I'm a little hungry right now because I didn't have breakfast, so I know a little bit. I can't say that I've ever actually known gnawing hunger, and I know there are people who have. But the fact is, if an animal is hungry, they will not lie down. And sheep are the same way. And sheep need green pastures in order to be able to have their hunger met. Green pastures are essential to the success of the sheep. And if you know anything about Palestine, where David was a shepherd, and if you know anything about where Keller raised his sheep, they're usually in dry or semi-arid areas because it's actually healthier for the sheep. But what does this mean then? It means that the shepherd has to provide a pasture for them, which very often means laying seed and irrigating and providing that. It's a lot of work on his part to provide those green pastures with that really good grass that they can eat and be satisfied, and so that they can lie down. It's a lot of work on the shepherd's part to be able to do this. And Christ has done this too. He has provided for us, for our spiritual hunger. He says, "I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey." And this is in Exodus 3 and 8. Keller referenced the land of milk and honey. And that's really an interesting description of the land of Israel, because if you think about it, you really know that it's pretty dry and it's a desert. But what's happening here? That how can it be a land of milk and honey? In that he has prepared a place in that there is rich green pasture, so that the ewes can drink or can eat plenty of really good grass, and the more good grass they eat, the better and more milk that they will make. And when you have a really good flowering environment, that allows the bees to make plenty of honey. And so there were locations, and there are locations in Israel and in these semi-arid areas where you could say it's a land flowing with milk and honey, in that there are good provisions there. Here I go with another Brazil reference, but we lived in a semi-arid area of Brazil, and it was on a river. And about 30 years ago, some export companies came in and decided to raise up plantations for exporting fruits and vegetables to other parts of the world, mostly fruits in our area. And so what did they do? They came in, they brought in irrigation, and they bought up plots of land, and they planted mangoes, and they planted grapes and bananas and a lot of other different fruits that could be cultivated there. And because they liked the semi-arid climate, because they like regions that are semi-arid because they can control the water, because places that have a lot of rainfall also have a lot of disease. And so when you're in a deserted area, there's less disease to deal with. And so that's really ideal for them. And so they would bring in the irrigation and irrigate. And so when we would fly into Petrolina coming from wherever we were, you could see these stark, dark brown areas that were just dry and barren. And then you would see these lush plantations where there were mango trees and grapes, and it was just so green. And that's what they're talking about, because they were well cultivated and they were producing so well. And it's like a land flowing with milk and honey. So where it's well cultivated and well provided, there will be no hunger. And so when the sheep have plenty of good green pasture that they can graze in, then they're satisfied and they don't feel hunger. And so those four conditions have been met. And the common denominator that I wanted to mention to you today is God. The freedom from fear, what is the solution? It's Christ's presence. The freedom from conflict, again, is Christ's presence. The freedom from aggravations is the presence of the Holy Spirit. And the freedom from hunger is Christ's provision. So the common denominator here is the Lord, our shepherd. So as we're concluding our lesson today, on the last page of your handout, I've given you kind of an assignment to think about, and to think about your own life, okay? We've been compared with sheep again, and we suffer from the same afflictions as sheep do that keep us from getting our rest. So I want you to think about which one plagues you most. Which promises then do you need to claim because of that? And I want you to write about it. Think about it and write about it. You don't have to share it. You can share it with anybody that you like, but you think about that and ask the Lord to help you with these things, because He has met all four of these conditions for us. We just need to claim it. So as we're thinking about the burden of weariness this week and getting rest, I pray that each one of you is able to just rest in Christ's presence in our lives, and the fact that He is not only our provider, He is our comforter, and He is ever there to help us. And let me close with saying that Jesus, with His own pierced hands, created a pasture for the soul. This is something that Max Lucado said in his chapter that we read today. So thank you, and you all have a great week.